All right, today is May 3rd, 2019. This is the Cluster API workstream talking about node lifecycle. I will share my screen real quick. Hopefully folks can see my screen.
Sure
I know
can.
folks are filtering in here, so. So my objective for today was to talk about the beginnings of the two proposals. The first one was the image stamper, minter, builder, whatever you want to call it. And the second one was to talk about node lifecycle hooks. I think node lifecycle hooks, to me, is very simple. It's basically defining a state machine, and we could probably do that completely asynchronously on the dock. I think what might be interesting to converse about in more detail is basically the image minter, builder, stamper, whatever the heck you want to call it. So before I get into that, there was a comment here from L. Hansen. I don't know if they're on the call right now.
Yeah, I'm here.
Yeah. Was what does immutable infrastructure mean for a UI or provider interface? Will an update be in action? I imagine that from a immutable infrastructure perspective, that it would be an asynchronous action where you declare a state for an update, and it would be a delete and create. But there could be a bunch of other behind the scenes action going on, like you could pre-stage things before you actually did the action. You know, and a person who wants to do things, I know there was a separate conversation I had with some other folks that says just because cluster API is immutable doesn't mean that you can't have something like a kubeADM operator that other people could use or design that could do in-place style updates. Does that answer your question?
One question is just like, what is, like, saying that it's immutable, does that like, what makes the providers implement it in an immutable way, and how can the users tell that it is or isn't immutable? Like, and will it be slower for users? Because like deleting and creating new VMs is much slower than just like updating a VM in place.
Yeah, I agree. So I think I talked with Rupa about this particular one. And yes, you are correct. There's no strong guarantees across providers. We could add a set of conformance tests that verifies behavior of this to be completely immutable if we wanted to over time. And I think that's probably a reasonable expectation for a conformance test. But there aren't strong guarantees. I think as we start to build some of the macro level behavior into Cluster API, I think we can get better adherence to it. So currently the way the behavior is done is it's federated, and we don't have sort of like a control flow for common behavior in the core. But I think as we push more of that into the core, it just basically calls out to hooks to the providers to make it much more systematic in the flow, so that an individual delete is a delete. You know, it's part of an update. A delete is one part, and then there's the create, or there's the create and then the delete. So
you might end up with hooks that are just create and delete, and providers wouldn't end up having an update hook, so they'd have to be immutable.
Correct. Now, they could always override if they wanted to, too. But as I mentioned before, there's nothing that prevents, if a person wants to do things in a mutable fashion, there's nothing to say that they can't do this with something like an operator pattern on an existing cluster using a kubeADM style update. Very analogous to how some CoreOS updaters used to work or do work today. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Next up, before we get into the proposal stuff, which work group is working on software provisioning across all the CAPI providers? that's what we're doing. That's part of the software provisioning, or the stamping or the minting or the tool that basically does the installation. It could be two parts, right?
Yeah, I think what I'm asking is the provisioning. Not so. Yeah, maybe I misunderstood the two parts, but the first part is everything that sort of a kubelet or a control plane needs, right? And then the second part is the rest of it, right?
Yes.
So about that second part, I feel like we haven't gotten there yet. We haven't talked about it, but for that second part, it seems like we're going to have to come up with some data model, and I don't know if we need to talk to the data model work group or how that's going to work. So by data model, I mean something like, for example, the kubeadm types, right? Where it's like the kubeadm types capture sort of all the different configuration that knobs and widgets and so forth that you might need to pass to kubeadm or really maybe a lot of different sort of
yeah. So I think this is the point of the extension points proposal, is that we don't need to come up with a declarative API for every piece of software that could exist on a node. Rather, we can define extension points, and then we can write arbitrary scripts to install whatever we want to install.
Yeah.
Okay, but and if we were going to if we're discussing this later in the meeting, we can I can cut this short, but it's fine to have extension points, but if our goal is to have a common way of, so for example, for argument's sake, right? Let's just say that we say, okay, the sort of the batteries included way of deploying will be to use kubeadm, and that will be you'll be able to use that with any CAPI provider, right? Any CAPI provider. If that's the case, then I think the requirement, one of the requirements there is to introduce some data model that is common to all providers to pass in the configuration. I suppose I guess one way of doing that would be to say, here, this is a common way, but it's still like a batteries included, but an extension. Is that sort of what we're?
Yeah, I see. Yeah, I get your point, which is if we could divine some commonalities between even these extension points, then it might be useful to have a declarative thing, but I don't think we know what that looks like yet. So we might as well just make them RPCs for Alpha 2. That's my
that's kind of out of our scope, to be honest. That's like the runtime configuration versus the sort of build time, because we kind of separated out. There's runtime behavior for node lifecycle, and there's build time behavior, and that's kind of the post boot runtime behavior that's part of the data model. And I know that Andy and Vince and Jason and folks have already been thinking about this in detail. So they have multiple incantations that are currently in flight to address that concern.
So I mean that's sort of my question. So it sounds like we're not going to be working on this.
No, not the configuration aspect. No, we're not going to do the plumbing for configuration as part of the node lifecycle. We're going to defer to the data model folks for how they want to do that.
Yep.
Okay, that answers the question. Thanks.
Yeah.
Actually, I see some potential networking configuration that we might want as inputs to the init process. Do you have a specific example in mind?
Do I, or does Daniel?
Does Daniel?
Do I have a specific example in mind of what?
Of like what these declarative inputs might be, because I actually just realized we have an issue, potential issue with networking, but I think that it is solved by just defining build time versus runtime parameters.
No, I mean, to me, the example is basically, everything that's, or most of the things that are in the kubeadm types. But, if that's out of scope for, for what we're doing, that's fine as long as it's in scope for some other work group. Because I know that's like we have a goal of letting some user have a single upstream way of provisioning software that can be used with any provider. So for example, right, today, if I use the AWS CAPI provider, I need to, I have maybe some ways of passing in some configuration because that uses kubeadm types, and if I use a GCP provider, I don't have that option. I have to go and maybe handcraft some shell scripts. So that
I'm going to punt. I'm going to time box and punt because they are working on this, and I know that. So we just chatted. Was it yesterday, Jason? I don't even know. We were talking like yesterday or the day before about this stuff. So
yeah. So I think there's a couple of issues at play. One is, what do we determine to be in scope versus out of scope for the actual kind of bootstrapping extension, for lack of a better terminology right now, and defining kind of that piece of it. If there is some commonality that we see as being needed for that, as far as like inputs or outputs, I think that's something that this group would be good to raise to the data model group. But I don't think this group should be trying to define a data model around the node itself.
Yeah, because I think there'd be too much overlap, right? Because you're going to have to plummet through potentially in multiple locations, which would affect the model. So I'm gonna defer. I think there's requirements that we can put on them, which are totally reasonable. But they're already thinking about what that use case that you mentioned, Daniel. So.
Okay, great. No, I wasn't sure where that was being discussed. So, thanks.
So I'm fine with punting on it for now. I will say I'm a little concerned because to me the runtime configuration of a node needs to be tightly coupled with image stamping if you want to have consistent behavior between systems that boot images and systems that install images. I don't know.
I still think I still think they're working on it and they're aware. So I agree with all the statements that have been said, but I'm specifically punting that we should give them requirements and make sure that the data model that they create adheres to those requirements. But with regards to the actual implementation, it's a matter of how the data gets there, right? And what data it is, and provided that we have the extension mechanism. So I'm okay with it. I think in reality, all these proposals need to come back together, right? There's going to be this point in time where we create these proposals, we need to get all of them in place, and then we're going to kind of rationalize them across all of the different work streams.
Makes sense.
Yeah. Right. So I kind of wanted to go into the two proposals that we outlined last time. We started creating a document. I'm terrible at naming, so I will gladly admit, I don't know if Danny's on the call. If you would like to call it something else, speak now or forever hold your peace. Would you prefer builder?
I just kind of raised, I wasn't sure if there was a specific reason. I was more familiar with the builder syntax of it.
Yeah. So. It's fine by me. I don't particularly care.
Thanks.
Yeah, my de facto go-to is if we have naming problems, I'll call everything cats. So don't rely on me. it's better to give me ideas. Otherwise, everything's going to be cats. Do other folks have comments there before we start getting into the meat and taters of everything else?
Cats as in like the animal? Cats?
Yeah, exactly, yes.
Okay. Do you have a big cat in mind for this one?
No, I don't.
Okay. Because we could go with ocelot. I like that.
All right. So let's walk through some of the details here and then talk about what is the purpose of this thing and what are the motivations and some of the goals and non-goals. And the goals and non-goals, I think, are the keys aspects of what we want and what we don't want. So I'll just read it out loud and feel free to interrupt or whatever, questions, comments, complaints, concerns. It's become commonplace for modern deployments to build cloud-based infrastructure to create immutable. Cloud-based deployments to create immutable infrastructure. All right, anyway, this sentence needs to be rewritten. Rewrite. There exist several examples of this already in the Kubernetes ecosystem. There's a number of utilities that do this similar things. Workstream, Cluster API AWS, the vSphere provider, the Amazon EKS, AMI, Talos, Linux, Git, etc. The purpose of the proposal is to distill down common requirements to provide a Kubernetes system with standard image building utility that can be leveraged by higher order systems such as Cluster API across providers. Now here's a question that Daniel wrote, and feel free to talk about this one. There exists the need for a Kubernetes ecosystem to be able to create reproducible IaaS images across providers. So is it the deterministic clause that
Yes, I saw that this was referencing the reproduciblebuilds.org, which has much more details around it. And so one of the things I at least wanted to get clarity on is that, do we expect different teams trying to run these builder steps potentially at different times to have the same output? And that's kind of where the deterministic piece was going on.
Yeah, across provide, I think reproducible should be the output, should be reproducible. I don't think you can guarantee deterministic behavior, especially across output artifacts, right? The end result of the image, the overall image should be reproducible. So we might want to put a clause there. I didn't actually put that specific link in there. I think Moshe put that link in there.
Okay. So we're okay with saying that, like, as we're downloading things during the build process, those may intentionally change over time as upstream dependencies are going to change. So we're okay with that.
So long as we have we should put some clauses on what reproducible means, in that for a given version of something, we'd expect the output to be consistent for that specific version.
Right. The Debian team, for example, reproducible means that the resulting image has the exact same hash as some other build system. Is that the kind of consistency that we want to go for?
I don't think so. I think the bits that we're specifically laying down as part of the image building process, so anything related to Kubernetes or the dependencies that we're necessarily explicitly installing, should be the same, across ones, but things further down in the dependency chain or the base LS bits should not necessarily be. I would expect those to be kind of the latest available at the time of running.
Right. I think if you even just consider the image format, that you won't produce the same hash. So that being said, I think we should tag these things to specific commit hashes, because even tags get changed sometimes. So I just want to call that out, that we should think about using commit hashes. Yeah.
So I tried to qualify this statement a little bit more. Images should be reproducible, and says for given versions / SHAs, the artifacts that we install should be consistent for that, or should be the same.
Would it be better if we called it like replicatable instead of reproducible to avoid confusion around just the terminology of reproducible?
Alternatively, you can also call it like these are just repeatable steps. They may change over time, but you'll at least have kind of that very confident knowledge of how it happened, and then can rely on upstream auditability to kind of know this is how the bits got there, and that's why we have them.
I don't really like that guarantee of repeatable. I think for a given version, it's more than repeatable. Like there's a guarantee that we provide for the software that we are installing, that it should be of the version, or the specific artifacts that we install should be guaranteed to be the versions that we specify.
Are we also making a guarantee that this image will work for these versions of Kubernetes, or are we saying
no? We can't make that. That's it. That guarantee is based upon the version of Kubernetes, the version of the utility that's used for Kubernetes at that time, which can vary. Like if you use kubeadm, you have a guaranteed window of time based upon the kubeadm config. Mm-hmm. But if you're using some other utility to install, there's no guarantee for version semantics, right? So we can't make that guarantee. I think we might want to put more qualifiers here. So if somebody wants to wordsmith, so I'll say it like this: to do better wordsmithing. So for those who like to partake in legalese and document writing, I highly recommend that you engage in this aspect of this spec.
Can this goal maybe create a requirement for the data model or extension work streams? So what this goal sounds like to me is we want to make sure that the user's intent is represented in the artifact. So user has intent of, I want to run Kate version foo, and the artifact should have version foo. In order to guarantee that, it seems like the natural way would be to have a common configuration to specify that this is the foo we're talking about.
I don't know about configuration, but there'd definitely be a way for it to verify, like via the standard Kubernetes API, that it is the version that's been specified.
So I feel like verification is a conformance question, or a test question at least. The reason specification is interesting is I'm only realizing this now. I must have missed conversations, but this is only about immutable infrastructure at this point, and so it kind of excludes the runtime configuration thing that we were talking about earlier.
So inside of the API model for most things, this would be specifying an AMI that is the output artifact of this tool, or a given version of a given. You'd be specifying the output artifact, right?
Right. What I'm pointing out is that this goal is not limited to immutable infrastructure. The goal of the user having intent and have it consistently applied across different cloud providers or infrastructure as service providers, that's the same goal that I think some of us have for image stamping should also be equivalent to runtime configuration insofar as the user has an intent, and we want to ensure that there's some sort of mechanism that is tested that ensures that intent becomes reality.
Yes.
Okay. I don't know when the next data model meeting is, but I'll follow up there.
Okay. A second goal would be to allow publishers the ability to install arbitrary software packages, containers, or other software needed for that deployment. Right. So we different providers, like we want to provide a utility that could be used not only by the CAPI providers, but to be augmented by consumers of the CAPI providers. So if a person has a specific sort of metrics monitoring, other tools that they wish to use, we should allow that capability. Questions, comments, complaints, concerns there? That could be preloading CNI, CSIs, all kinds of other things.
Do we want to have a statement whether or not that be composable, in a sense that you start off with a generic image and customize it, or it's purely a function of the build process that you can generate a new image but will be built from scratch?
Do we care to have that constraint?
I don't know.
I think we can add that as a constraint later on, if we care. Does anyone else have comments?
Yeah, I kind of think that we should not build it off of that we should use some known image, because one of the things that I'd like to, for the image stamping, to be able to do is keep track of the manifest that built the image from, so that end user can introspect the image and see where did this come from.
Well, that's provenance. So like we could just say ensure provenance of the output artifact. Now again, I'm terrible at wordsmithing, so if somebody wants to walk through this and clarify the language, I know we're all on the call. There's this idea that of implied context, and then there's explicit ways of articulating the requirements. I'm all ears or game for anyone who wants to help with making things more explicit.
Can we modify the goal or mention somewhere that this tool, and I mean, I think we've talked about this before. I don't know if there's new opposition to this idea, but that the tool is that the tool doesn't just spit out images, although I guess it could, I mean, we have to have images at the end, but that someone who has you know, a machine that's booted, the operating system has been, you know, provisioned, has networking, etc., can run this tool on that machine, on that file system, and, you know, and get all of this, you know, all of this very, you know, very opinionated and sort of vetted functionality, even if, you know, even if that user isn't creating an image at the end of the day, but just wants, okay, I have an operating system that I've just booted, and I want it to, you know, be able to run a conformant Kubernetes node.
Yeah, so we talked about this before as being broken into two parts. One is the software installation aspect of it, and the second is the image creation of that software installation. So I think that's a fair goal and requirement we should write down.
Thanks.
So there's two other things that I think that long term we will want to address. I'm not sure if it falls under the goals of the image stamping, because this I consider this like the image building process. But you know, where do we store these images, and how do we get the images into the infrastructure?
Out of scope.
I think those. Okay.
Totally out of scope. So like we've even said, there's down below there's a section for non-goals, and sort of the publication of where these images reside, and we could even say the storage of it too, is out of scope of this. The sole purpose of this tool is just to create the artifact.
Right, because that'll vary widely among providers. Like imagine you're doing this bare metal on-prem. You might build an ISO and distribute it via DHCP or whatever. So
let's talk about image formats. Image formats should support following. Should support, should create, should allow.
We've got a bullet point for that.
What?
We have a bullet point for that already, a little way down. Supported image formats. There you
go. This is supported. Okay. That somebody mentioned ISOs. I think that's a reasonable thing to expect.
I want to, I guess, call out that for AMIs, the file system is, I think, separate from the kernel, right? Where that I think that is not the case for well, for ISOs. I'm less sure about Azure images and OVAs, but
that's super ancient. That hasn't been the case for a very long time. AMIs, HVM, almost all instances you boot today are HVM, and are just a standard standard disk image, but on S3 buckets.
Okay, thanks.
What are the terms for GCE images? Does anyone know?
I think they're just called images, honestly.
Are there other goals or requirements folks want to put on to this tool? Or should we move on? And we can always pop back to.
For image formats, we might want to support the Pixie related things, so init.rd and Vim for Windows.
So that's a question. Do we want to put the constraints on, at least for the time being, on Windows support, given the fact that we don't actually have Windows support plumbed all the way through? I don't think we should, whatever our tooling we create should have that as a future requirement, but do we want to make that a requirement now?
So do we actually have a requirement that the Windows and Linux tooling is the same? It seems to me like we can easily just provide two separate tools with the same output requirements.
We could have a single repo that actually could be composed of multiple tools if we wanted to.
Yeah, I think so. We probably need it as a requirement, but maybe not constrain us in terms of timeline. Like expected that it won't ship on the same timeline.
I think my biggest concern with trying to build Windows into the tool is that we're going to end up with a rabbit hole of trying to build kind of abstractions across Windows and Linux.
Oh yeah, definitely not the same tool. The way Windows imaging works is so different from Linux. It's not going to be possible.
Well, even like how we would lay down bits on the image itself, I would worry would diverge quite a bit.
Well, I assume that there will be plugins, right? We'll have some kind of plugin model, and for the Windows, we'll launch something or call some plugin that will actually does work, and we don't have to build that tool now.
So a good lowest common denominator format is actually just a tarball starting at the root file system. So I'm going to add that.
Hey Tim, back for the up in the goal. I do want to add one more goal.
Okay.
The one of the goals is that it should be you should not require. Okay, I'll just say it. You do not require a hypervisor to run on your system to run. I don't know what is the best way to describe that. But today, the problem with Packer today is that for building an OVA is that you need to have a hypervisor on your machine in order to build an OVA.
Is that a requirement though that we want to? Is that a constraint we want to have?
It definitely restricts how we build some of these images in an automated way, especially in like CI or.
So you could use Fusion from my understanding of Packer is you could use Fusion on a local machine and you should be able to run it in CI to get the output artifacts.
Yeah. It's
not pretty, but I don't, like for Windows, I don't know how you would get around that. For some forms of image generation, how would you not do this?
Well, so on my previous project, we looked at things like LinuxKit and Packer, and then we decided to basically build on that, where we built the images from scratch, and we did it mostly because of the Packer's requirement for the hypervisor for building OVAs. Yeah, well, we can table that for now and then come back to it. But that has always been the limiting constraint for us.
Should we talk about non-goals? I mentioned before that the publication of the image is the non-goal. Publication and storage.
So the one question I have around that is if we're saying that we're creating like an AMI or an Azure image, is that actually, are we actually creating those artifacts if we don't publish them to the cloud provider? Not necessarily the marketplace, but.
I can create local AMIs. I've been able to do that for years. It doesn't mean that you can't really, you can use them if you want to. There's weird ways you can get around it to use it. But the publication is a separate step. What I'm saying is that it's not a responsibility of this tool to do that push. It's up to you to figure out how you want to do that push.
We could ask the cloud providers to provide that, last mile tooling if they so choose, right? To implement some sort of, like wrapper around an AWS import image call. Something that calls this tooling, generates the image, and then pushes it. Yeah,
I think that's totally fair. I just think it's not a responsibility of this tool to do that push, right? I think a non-goal too is like to upgrade and downgrade semantics. That's not part of this tool. It just basically spews out stuff. Are there other non-goals that folks want to make sure that we're explicit about? Really? Nobody?
A little bit of a theoretical question on that provider stamper boundary. Is there any place where those sorts of discussions will happen? So if these outputted files are going to be given to providers, Does there need to be some sort of common interface so that providers know how to use them? Or are we going to assume that they're in the target format, or do providers need to do some validation, making sure they understand those files that they're going to try to import? So any sort of extra metadata we should be worried about?
I think we could put that as extra requirements if we want to, about like if we need to insert metadata. But I don't know if we need to qualify constraints at this time. I think this is more of like, this is one of those weird KEPs where it's like, we're not going to know all the details until we actually really start implementing this. I just want to make sure that we have explicit boundary lines around what are the high-level goals and what are the high-level non-goals. Like where does this tool stop? I think the idea of stopping at the publishing is legit. Whether or not we have a constraint on the tool to provide metadata for providers is TBD.
Will the tool itself be able to enforce the reproducible aspects of it? I mean, if we're saying that you'll just generate a SHA and that will define it, that's fine, but I wasn't sure if the tool itself would be, you could run it twice and then the tool itself could tell you that, yep, it built exactly the same thing the second time.
And we said repeatable. This is the part where, who's talking right now?
Mark Emice.
Mark.
From WeaveWorks.
We talked about this earlier. That was one of the earlier things. We said reproducible at the beginning, but because reproducible implies deterministic, we said repeatable.
Yep, I remember that. Sorry. All right.
Yeah.
I retract the question.
Yeah.
I mean, that said, it might be good to have some type of a manifest of the bits that this tool is responsible for, to be able to use as a comparison for the bits that we do want to be kind of reproducible, maybe.
Yeah, I think that's fair.
Well, didn't we already specify that down in the provenance of the image?
That's the base. I think
Okay.
there's the spec and then there's the status. So
Okay.
I think we can delineate the two. Like provenance, this basically says here's what we're specifying, but we should also say like I don't know.
Okay.
Feel free again to like rearrange this, but I just want to make sure that we touch both points, that there's a specification, then there's the output artifact generation, which allows you to say like, did I get exactly what I specified?
So one non-go, I don't know if this should be a non-go or not, or whether we even need to state it or not, but the tool is just a builder, right? And so we don't need the tool to guarantee that the node actually boots up, and I mean all the software are compatible, and
yeah.
Yeah, so maybe we need to specify that out.
I can't spell today. Other non-goals?
What about a dry run capability? Do we want to say the tool won't support that or should support that? I mean, especially if we're going to have a bomb now being generated, it seems like it might be a nice feature to be able to dry run it and say, here's the bomb for what would be created.
Other ideas? Keep them coming. This is good stuff. It's better to be explicit than implicit. I do know that Moshe wrote in this implementation example. He's not here in the call. And he's kind of running asynchronously on some of this. I haven't had enough time to really dig through the details here, but I wanted to like circle back to it. I don't know if I'm educated enough to talk to it right now. But the high level objective that I wanted to accomplish for this meeting was to make sure that like we agreed upon the set of goals and the set of non-goals.
I mean, the only thing I see that is maybe a little questionable in the config atom is that it is combining the two parts, I think.
The software installation and
yeah, the software.
Yeah, I think one of the most valuable things that we can do is draw. I was about to say line in the sand, but like it's not a line in the sand. Like we want a hard line between you're installing the software and now you are building the image. You know.
I think that's a highly useful distinction.
Although there are things that we will be doing in that second step that will require, you know, I guess, for example, I don't know if the kernel is I don't know if that's going to be part of the second, if that's the second part or the.
I'm going to defer on this particular one. I'm going to read through it again later on because Moshe came in here and kind of edited this asynchronously. I do think that there's bigger questions I want to ask right now in particular. Like one of the big questions I want to ask is that like Packer pretty much does a lot of the things that we have asked in our requirements. Like it has all the capabilities that, you know, of having a separate software installation tool that we can use. It has a number of output artifacts. What I wanted to make sure that we talked about here today is why not Packer? Because I've heard a bunch of constraints that people have talked about, but they haven't actually written them down. So I want to write them down and be explicit about it. Like, what are the constraints with Packer that says that we should not or cannot use Packer for this particular type of tool as one of the things that to solve our problems?
Tim, I believe this is a very valid question because I have to say I have joined quite later into the conversation. However, all the time I'm asking myself one question: why? What are the shortcomings of Packer or any other tool?
Yes, exactly. I don't want to build a tool if I don't have to. I'd rather use another tool, and if we need to publicly shame people to use them to get meet our requirements, then we do that, and we do whatever we can to make that happen. But the question I want to ask the group here is like, why can't we use Packer? What are the constraints that specifically do not allow us to use Packer?
I think Packer needs plugins for each provider, right? So we should at least go look at those and see if those plugins are supported to the level that we need or like do the things that we need. I also think for some of them, for example, if you want to build an image for like VMware vSphere, you have to be able to run in that environment with the Packer plugin to build it, which can create some challenges.
Yeah, but again, like I mentioned before, it is not unheard of to have VMware Fusion running on a CI box that produces the artifact for you.
Yeah, sure. It's just a question of, you know, how are we going to get that infrastructure if we end up needing it?
Yeah.
Or whoever, so.
Yeah, so we just went through the process of implementing a Packer plugin for our stuff. And I think the abstraction that they have is actually really good. So at some point you need some clean environment to install things. So I don't have anything negative to say here. I'm curious to know why people don't like Packer. If anyone doesn't like Packer.
I wouldn't say that we don't like Packer. It was the hypervisor limitation. That was we actually do like Packer. was the hypervisor requirement that prevented us from using it in my last project.
So I know Justin Santa Barbara had some issues with Packer when they were building images for cops, but I can't remember what they were off the top of my head. So it might be good to solicit some feedback from Justin in this area.
I have him listed here.
Oh, yep.
Does Packer allow leave any type of manifest bombed as we described it above in the final image?
It depends upon what tool you use to do the software installation. So like if you use a tool like Ansible to do the installation for Packer, then you can absolutely get a manifest and an output list of what you've created.
Okay. Now, does that go onto the image itself, or is it only during the creation process? I mean, the post-creation process and only?
It would have to be some that that whoever's implementing this tool would have to define as part of the provision or configuration for Packer.
Okay.
So I'd really like to extrapolate this question more because I don't want to reinvent the square wheel. Software engineers like to software engineer, but like I'd rather use tools that are well established in the community and make sure that they meet our requirements. And it's got that bifurcation split that we talked about. Like you could have an Ansible script for doing software installation, and then the Packer has a multiple extension module for you to create our output artifacts for a number of different tools. The one requirement, though, that Packer does place on you is that it requires hypervisor.
But do you believe that requiring hypervisor is that really important? Because in the end, we are going to get an image. What's an image? It's from a file system point of view, it's a file system. And beneath that, the block level, the block device. And now you can actually convert between the block devices formats.
I personally don't think it's a limitation, but I know that other people had raised it as a limitation.
So I would think it would definitely be a limitation if this is something that we wanted to run within the constraints of, say, PROW.
That was the biggest, like I mentioned, like before when I mentioned this, that I was thinking of PROW when I mentioned CI. That maybe we don't build this in PROW, right? I mean, that's always the argument that we build it somewhere else.
Yeah, there's a million other CI tools. We don't need to use PROW.
Yeah.
PROW is a turducken. So it's Kubernetes running on Kubernetes, and it gets weird, right? Like I could see how this requirement of all the different incantations of different hypervisors running would be weird, right? But that's not to say that we couldn't create an AMI that does all the things, right? And has like a Jenkins utility, or you name a different, like a Circle CI instance or something like that. I don't know.
There is one more requirement that I think that we should spell out. While we're talking about Packer, I wonder if it fulfills this requirement. I assume that because Packer is so well known, so that any distro image that we create with it will be supported by the distro author, right? Specifically Red Hat. You know, one of the issue in my previous project was that, you know, some customers they have contracts with certain Linux distro, and they needed that support contract to be to be guaranteed with whatever image that we lay out.
I don't see why it wouldn't. Jason, can you think of any reason why?
Not that I'm aware of. We would have some challenges, especially if we're talking about like a paid OS subscription like RHEL, where we would have to, as part of the image build process, if we wanted to update for security fixes and things like that, we would have to register that system to be able to pull those updates. And then we would have to ensure that before we kind of wrap up the image, we clean up, you know, that subscription content. But I don't think there was anything that would void any contracts.
I think this is where a lifecycle hook might be, like provide license material for things, you know.
And you could always create your own, your plugin for your provisioner could do pieces of that too. So as part of your, if you did a plugin for a provisioner, you should be able to do that individual check. So it's possible that we don't use default provisioners and that we have like I made a step, and that seems reasonable too, where we do a set of checks or guarantees before we actually kick it. But I really want to keep on hitting this thing. I really want to know why Packer isn't good enough, because it's.
Yeah, I think the license thing or OS contracts. Is this what we mean by contracts? Licensing?
Yeah.
I think it's kind of out of scope here because the onus is on whoever adopts this tool to make sure they're not violating licenses, I guess.
Well, that prevents customers from actually using the tool, right? They, I mean, for at least for like VMware, they expect that we take that extra step for them. So
I think we can qualify that. I don't see there being any reason from what I've seen thus far as it being a limitation.
Okay.
So I just realized that one of the other people that I've heard voice objection to the use of Packer was also Tim Hawken as well.
What was his objection?
I don't remember. So we went through this when we were trying to build out the tool for the AWS provider, and we're trying to get kind of the images that we were publishing into a CNCF owned account rather than a Heptio/VMware owned account. And I got a lot of vague responses from people that there were some non-enumerated security issues that people had related to Packer, but I never got anything concrete back.
If people are talking in chat, I'm going to ask that they speak up because chat's ephemeral. So please read it in the doc or speak up.
Can we stage this where we say, initially we're just producing a tarball and then sort of figure out, what it takes to go from tarball to the different supported image formats?
We can, but there's a little bit of coupling between the actual operating system that we might want to use in each case. So, like we can still have the two stages, but even stage one will be different among providers, I think.
Ace had mentioned that like one of his annoyances with Packer is it's not very self-contained. It manages the whole life cycle, boots up VMs, manages resources, touches many pieces of the puzzle. That's a fair statement. I think if we decouple it into software installation or software manifest creation or software bundle, and then if we create separate steps, I would almost even think there might be even be a third step, or the last third step would be the actual generation itself. That would isolate it even further. Well, I didn't take a look at the time, but we're actually at time. So my plan is to hopefully have this thing more sussed out. So if you have questions, comments, complaints, concerns, please add them to this document. I think this is a good conversation. I'm going to go through Moshe's proposal here in a little more detail and try to see if we can tease apart some of the details. But if folks could take a look at the requirements and the goals, I think that's the primary function, and also take a look at what constraints are not being met by Packer today. I think that would also be helpful. And hopefully, we only have one more meeting scheduled. Hopefully we can have enough content in our documents that we can start to do things a little more asynchronously. So again, if you don't have a copy of the document, I will send a link to the mailing list this afternoon, and folks should be able to, should have edit rights. So.
Also, if you check out the forum, we have all these documents linked in the forum.
So I locked one of the
documents. Take care. Thanks, everybody.
All right, thanks.
Oh, thanks. See you. Bye.
Thanks, everyone. Cheers.